Good evening, everyone. Good evening. It's always a pleasure to be here. It has been a few weeks since I was able to give a talk, so it's nice to be able to come back here and do this. And before I begin, I just wanted to make a plea to everyone to, even if it is your first time being here or your first time exposed to Spiritism, to take a look at the material that has been compiled by our master from Lyon, Allan Kardec, the work that he put together, the information that he brought to us in the Spirit's book, and all the other works, the 5 seminal books of Spiritism, specifically the Gospel according to Spiritism, because there is so much wealth in it. And it brings one so much joy to read that material, because from personal experience, my life could be in severe trouble, it could be in shambles. But as long as I'm reading the gospel and the material that's contained within that work, which is a work of art because it was a work that was brought to us by the greater spirits, by Jesus himself, that Kardec formulated, when I have the knowledge and I read about those studies and I reflect upon it, I feel full, nourished. That existential void is gone. So I'm happy. No matter what's going on in my life, I'm satisfied because I get to learn and understand the teachings of Christ and I learn the truth. So my plea to you here tonight is to take the time. 10 minutes a night, 10 minutes in the morning, doesn't matter. Read the book, specifically the Gospel according to Spiritism, and understand what Christ was trying to teach us from front to end. Don't just open it and read one passage. Read everything and reflect upon it. So that was my plea to you before I get into the subject tonight. So, getting into the subject tonight, we have to think of everything in life as being in stages or in cycles. Nothing goes from point A to point B in a straight line. This isn't geometry or mathematics. Everything that goes from point A to point B usually has a pretty convoluted line. It just doesn't go from here to here. Our life isn't one straight line because we often deviate from our path many times. We get distracted. If we're on that highway that's supposed to take us to that final destination, oftentimes we get off on an exit by accident because we're not looking at the map that has been bestowed to us and we're not paying attention to what we're doing. And we might be off the route or the path for a while before we realize that we must return to this highway to continue on the right journey. So life, as I said, is not a straight path. It's completely convoluted. And so goes the cycle of everything else, not just our lives in this material world, but the spiritual life. Nature has its cycles. Countries go through cycles, empires fall, nations rise. The cosmos goes through its cycles, the solar system, the galaxies, the nebulae. Everything is cyclical. Everything is within a stage. And within that stage is contained the bottom and the top, the trough and the peak. If we think of it in a graphical sense, if we have a graph of the stage which we are in at this moment, there's a beginning point and an end point. And surely we're going to get to that end point, but it's not a straight line. It goes something like this, up and down, up and down, up and down. But the average line to be drawn is going to be a straight path. But all of us are within that stage. Everything is within that stage. So everything is relative to that stage. And we have to think about Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher of the 18th century. He has a very little known work that talks about the natural universal history of the heavenly worlds. I believe that's the title. And in it, he proposes a theory that the further away from the sun a planet is located, the more advanced is that planet or the beings that supposedly inhabit that planet. Because the closer to the sun we get, the denser and more solid is a planet. And the further away from the sun, the less dense a planet is. We can see this, the evidence of this, by looking at Mercury, Venus, Mars, and Earth and Mars, which are solid planets. And as we know, Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, Uranus are gaseous planets. and they're further away from the sun. And it is interesting that he said this and proposed this theory because he could be considered a precursor to the Spiritist thought and the Spiritist philosophy, because in the 19th century, when Kardec brought to us the knowledge about Spiritism, the higher spirits, through means of communication, through the mediumship of those who brought us these messages from the other dimension or the other world, taught us that the planets are indeed found in different stages of evolution, relative stages. And the Earth specifically, to simplify these stages and these categories, they gave us 5 different categories. Specifically for Earth, we are found in a stage of trials and expiations. So we are within that relative stage of evolution. We have our trials and our expiations in our lives here on Earth when we incarnate in this planet. So we can't say that we have perfection here. Not the supreme perfection, the complete perfection, because as I said, everything is relative. So we have a relative perfection here on this planet. What does perfection mean? The etymology of the word perfection is derived from Latin, and per means through completely, and facere, which is per facere, facere means to do. So perfection is to do completely. Can we do completely here on Earth? We can, in a relative sense, but we can't do it in an absolute sense. Because there is only one absolute and one absolute truth, which is the cosmic entity we call God, the intelligence that oversees the cosmos and the creation in which we reside and live. And it's sort of funny to see some of the teachings from Jesus, because we can think of it as a contradiction to what I've just said. Because in Matthew 5:44 and Matthew 5:46 through 48, he says, "But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your brothers, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." That is a difficult thing to do. But we have to understand that love is one word in a primitive language that humanity uses, specifically English in this case, to define an emotion of varying degrees. It's not one sole degree, because there are various types of loves, or love. There's the love of a family member, the love of a husband, of a wife, of a son, of a daughter, of a brother or sister. So what kind of love are we talking about here? Is it that type of love that we ought to have to what's quote-unquote our enemies, or who is quote-unquote our enemies? No. The type of love that Jesus is talking about here is a love of understanding, of comprehending the situation of that brother or sister who finds himself yet erring in his ways, who is antagonistic to us because we may view things differently than he or she does. So they're not necessarily our enemy, because if we're all sons and daughters of God, we're all the same family. So no one here on this planet is our enemy. We view them as enemies because we don't recognize the fact that life doesn't begin or end here. Most of us are too busy thinking that it does begin and end here, which is why we don't see beyond the immediate farce of enemies, of race, color, sex, whatever. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? It's easy to love those who love us. It doesn't take much effort. When somebody is kind to us, we're thankful, and it's easy to be kind in return. Reciprocity is easy because you're receiving that which you want to give back. But what about when you give it and you don't receive it? That is the most difficult thing. And that is why we should love our enemies, because that is the true essence of love. Because if love encompasses all virtues, can we imagine what love to our enemies, or those that antagonizes us, encompasses? That is the true love. The love of understanding that that brother is one day going to transcend that situation, and he too will realize that he's wrong, if he is wrong, if it is not us that is wrong. So, and greet only your brothers, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Can we be perfect like our heavenly Father? No. Because if we could be perfect as our heavenly Father, that would mean that we'd be equal to God, and that's an impossibility. God is the definition of perfection. So we cannot be such perfection. We can aim and strive to be better. That is what Jesus means. We can aim and strive to be better ourselves, to be more perfect. Because the more perfect we are, the further we can extend our love. The more we understand the true reality and situation of life, when we understand the purpose of our essence here on earth, what we are meant to do here, that we are here to fulfill our mission, that we are here to love one another, when we begin to embrace the teachings of Christ, we can extend this love. We improve ourselves, and we try to perfect ourselves and become better and better. So in a relative sense, we are going to be perfect as our Father. Jesus was the perfect man here on earth. He demonstrated this example to us because he loved the worst elements of society in his era. Those that even today are shunned by most people. The lepers, the prostitutes, those who robbed. Those are the people that Jesus loved the most, because those are also his brothers. Those are also his sons and daughters. That is the example he set for us, and that's why he said, love your enemies. He demonstrated to us what that is like and the rewards that you get from doing so. So in the Gospel according to Spiritism, we find the degree to which we are perfect is in direct relation to how far we can extend our love. And it was for this reason that Jesus said this to his disciples, because back then, humanity didn't understand the nuances of love. They were still very young, very immature. So Jesus had to speak in objective ways, direct ways, to really impact and reach the center or the heart of the individuals who listened to him at that era. That's why he spoke in parables and in allegories. You don't teach a class of kindergartners concepts of science or math directly. You teach them through allegories, through stories. Children's books are riddled with stories, not direct explanations of points and concepts. That is what Jesus did. Jesus was essentially teaching the kindergarten class of earth what it is that we need to learn and what it is that we need to do. So what can we do to love? We have to be good. We have to be good people. How can we be good people? By observing the divine statutes, by observing the laws of the Father, by following in Jesus' footsteps. It is in question 625 of the Spirit's book that we find that Jesus was the perfect example, the guide and model for humanity. So let us follow in his footsteps. He is sitting there waiting for us to awaken to him and his teachings. So, who is a good person? The good person is the one who always listens to his conscience before he does anything, who always thinks before he acts, who always reflects before he does anything, who always thinks, am I acting in accordance with the divine laws? Am I acting in a way that my conscience is going to be okay? Is my conscience going to be all right with what I'm about to do? What does a good person do? They're just. They're always fighting for justice, protecting the weak, loving everyone, loving their enemies especially, because they recognize that their enemies are, again, like I said, just a brother or sister that's still yet to learn a few more things. And the good person, they realize that the trials of life are nothing more than objects that are sent to us, obstacles that are sent to us in order for us to purify ourselves, to atone ourselves for those mistakes that we have made in the past. And they accept this. The good person accepts this situation in their life. And that is why they are good. That is why they are tranquil and in harmony, because they realize their position on earth. They understand that whatever comes my way is there for a reason. When we absorb and understand the teachings of Spiritism and the teachings that life transcends this existence, it is like the man who speaks or looks from the top of a mountain at the very bottom. Everything becomes minute, minuscule, and unimportant. When before, standing at the foot of this mountain, the obstacles of life looked immense, tall, impossible to overcome. But now, having learned the truth and ascending and transcending, things become much easier. We accept it because we distance ourselves from the idea and the notion that this is the only existence. And the good person never judges anyone because Christ never judged anyone. Who are we to point out the speck of dust in our brother's eyes when we might have a plank in our own? Christ came here and didn't judge the worst elements of society. As I said, he loved them. He cared for them and taught them the way, the truth, and the life. So, if he didn't judge, if God doesn't judge, who are we to judge anyone? The good person realizes this. Because the best judge of anyone is ourselves. The best judge of anyone is our conscience. So before we point the finger in anyone's direction, point the finger in our direction. Because we have many defects, many flaws that must be corrected and righted before we can even begin to think to help someone else to try to tell them that they're doing something wrong. That's why it's so important when we think about the adulterous woman in that parable. And Jesus said to those who were about to stone her, if anyone of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her. So how can we throw a stone at anyone else when we ourselves more than likely have sinned? Sinned, that is a religious word, and it carries very heavy consequences, but let's just say we've erred, we've made mistakes, we might have done wrong to someone else without us knowing. And so how can we throw a stone at someone else when we know that we might have done this? And that is why when this occurred and Jesus said this, those that were around him, that were around this adulterous woman, began to leave because they realized, oh, I've also committed these sins. I've also made these mistakes. So I'm going to begin to walk away because who am I to judge? So this is what a good person is. A good person doesn't judge. And a good person has faith and they do good for the sake of goodness. They are just, kind-hearted, and impartial. They're impartial because they realize, as I said, we're all children of the one God. Reincarnation teaches us, one of the main points and topics of Spiritism, teaches us that we don't live only one life. We live many existences. And if we live many existences, we've all been in different cultures, different countries, different titles, different positions. Someone who is white today may have been black in another life. Someone who is black today may have been white. Someone who is Asian today may have been Mexican, and so on and so forth. Someone who was a king yesterday can be a janitor today. Someone who is a president today can be a janitor tomorrow. So looking at it from that perspective, how can we be partial to anyone? How can we have racism or differences? Because we're all equal. We all go through the same stages, through the same types of existences, through the same types of lives. And they're also guided by love. They do not nourish any bitterness or hatred, much less revenge. They're humble and they respect the laws of nature, because if you don't respect the laws of nature, you don't respect God. Because the laws of nature are universal laws. They're the laws of the Father. And if we transgress those laws, we are going against him. We're deviating from that path. We're not following that righteous path. And eventually, we're going to have to go back, because it can only go so far away from the right path before we have to return. So we have our duties. We have our duties in this world to our family, to our careers, to perhaps our country, society. But these aren't the duties that we're talking about here today. The duties that we're talking about here today is the duty of the Spirit. To be better. Because the sole purpose of a spirit that incarnates on this earth, the sole purpose of each one of us is to advance, is to become better, to perfect ourselves, to perhaps one day become as perfect as our Heavenly Father is perfect. That is our goal. So our duty is to observe the right path. Our duty is to listen to our conscience, to not do what is wrong. It is difficult because oftentimes we have desires and passions that battle against our conscience. And often we succumb to those and we instead engage in those things instead of actually listening to our consciences and being and observing our duty as spirits that are incarnated, that have to serve and serve as instruments of the Divine Father, serve as instruments of Christ here on this earth. That's why it's so important to observe these duties. And it is interesting because duties can be something that sometimes we are reluctant to observe, that we do not want to do. They can be composed of things that we have to do on earth. For example, we begin with our education. We are educated by our parents, educated by our school, by our church or our mosque or whatever it may be. And then we have to act in a certain polite manner, because that is what society demands of us. So in essence, we are forced to act accordingly. That is the beauty of the intelligence of the cosmic entity known as God, because we are forced through reincarnation, through living in a society, to act in a certain way that forces us to become better. Because our duty is, in society, to be polite to others, it can be something like opening a door for someone, pulling the chair out, saying thank you, whatever it may be. It forces us to be good. It forces us to be good. And eventually this leads to an automatic behavior that's innate to you and inherent to you. Before you realize it, you're being polite without even knowing. Because before it was this artificial virtue, this fake virtue, because you're only polite because society demands you to be polite, or you have to be polite. But then eventually that becomes something natural, a behavior that you have to, for some reason, engage in. And that automatically transfers into a virtue without us even knowing, unbeknownst to us. Because we no longer fight against those duties, we've accepted them and embraced them. And now the virtues become something that we have to do and act in and perform. Because when we observe these duties, we have to understand that God has one plan for everything, and it is to reach and complete his work. So all of us have this one goal, this one objective. You must ultimately express in yourself the most sublime virtues, for this is the aim of God, who will not settle for an unfinished picture. God expects all the beauty of your soul to shine in all its grandeur. So once we have this duty within us, inherent within us, we observe the laws, not only the laws of the world, because many people might observe the laws of the world because they don't want to deal with the consequences. Somebody might not commit a crime because they don't want to be arrested. Is that noble? It's not noble, but it forces that person to observe a certain law and not to commit a wrongful deed that he will have to deal with a consequence later, be it a consequence in the earthly life through the earthly laws, or a consequence in the spirit world later on when he discarnates and leaves this life, when he dies and the body perishes. And then when we begin to have these virtues within us, we embrace these activities. We begin to be kind to others. We begin to do what is right, what is expected of us. The duty is left behind and we become virtuous, as I said. And the virtue becomes this exchange of love. And at first, as I said, we might do it because it is forced upon us and we want to be polite to others and we want to be kind to others. But eventually, that reluctance turns into something different, because we begin to see how good it feels to be virtuous, to help others, to do what is right, to do what is good. And all of a sudden, we feel rewarded by being virtuous. We feel good about doing these things. It is a prize for us. And before we know it, we become happy. We are happy that we are being virtuous. And virtuous becomes natural to us, just like duty eventually became natural to us. So we go from, we are born, we have our education, we have to be polite, we have our duties, and then from duties we become virtuous. And once we become virtuous, from there it's an easy step towards love, towards loving our enemies, because we've transcended all of these other progressions, all of these other stages of relative understanding to reach a relative perfection. And the true virtue doesn't make a show of itself. When it is divine, it moves quietly off stage. A person who is virtuous is not going to show off, because the moment you do something good to someone and you want to tell someone else, not for the fact that you want to share with them how good it felt, but you want to share with them because you want to glorify yourself, you've erased and effaced all of the benefits of that good deed. Because those who are truly kind do things in secret. unbeknownst to anyone, but known to God, because God sees everything. Christ is seeing everything. So they're seeing how good how good we are being, or how virtuous we are being. And the good many people the world, so these are the good many people the world does not know about, but they are known to God. None of these good people are aware of the fact that they are virtuous. Rather, they're carried along by their saintly inspirations. They practice goodness with abandonment and complete forgetfulness of the self. They do good for goodness sakes. That is the good person we talked about in the previous slide. They're just so happy with doing what is right that it just comes naturally. That is what's wonderful about virtue. And it is better to have fewer virtues and be modest than have many and be proud. What good is it to say, oh yeah, I'm kind, I'm respectful, I'm this, I'm that, I'm that. Well, you're being proud because you're listing all of your supposed qualities. So it is better to say, well, you know, I'm not that kind, I'm not that respectful, but I am modest, and I recognize my frailties and my shortcomings. Because a good person, the virtuous person, engages in true charity. What is true charity? Because Allan Kardec, told us that without charity there is no salvation. That is an axiom of the Spiritist doctrine. What is true charity? Charity has a triple aspect in the view in the Spiritist perspective: benevolence, indulgence, and forgiveness. What good is it to engage in charity, give material charity to someone, but even though you're giving them something that they might need, you still don't agree with them, or you think they're beneath you, or you think they're wrong? That's not charity. You're just doing an outward ritual. You're showing off to someone that, yes, I give to people. I give to this needy person. That is not true charity. Because we need to have indulgence. Indulgence means we have to understand, comprehend why that individual is in that situation. Why is he in that position? And understand that perhaps we were in that position in a past life, in a past moment, past existence. Perhaps we recognize in him us in the past, and that's why we are so antagonistic and want to distance ourselves from him. But it is in this indulgence that we provide true charity, because we recognize in him a part of us in the past, and we want to help them, and we want to provide for him. And forgiveness, because forgiveness is not in the sense of forgiving sins. Forgiveness is, again, just understanding, comprehending that individual, being kind to him, knowing why, understanding why he's in that position, what led him to that position, and knowing that eventually in the future, for certain, he is going to be better. He's going to see things how they truly are. He is going to improve. He is going to finally ascend and transcend, like perhaps we have already transcended in comparison to that brother who still finds himself in a troublesome situation. And we find, and Spiritism helps us in many ways, because it opens up to us the notion of reincarnation, as I mentioned before. Because reincarnation forces us to come into a material body, and in this material body, we have desires, we have passions, we have needs. So these passions, they force us, they compel us to get up and work. We can't just sit around and wait for things to come to us. We have to eat, so we have to go get food. We have to work, because we have to have a living. We have to have a roof over our heads. We have to pay bills. So being in the body necessitates all of this. Because God, somebody could say, why doesn't God just create someone who is perfect already? Well, where is the merit in that? What has that being or that entity deserved? What has he done to earn the merit to be perfect? That is why we have these lives. That is why we have these existences, to gain this merit through hard work and effort, to learn, to grow, to become perfect. That is the purpose of our existence here in this world. And Spiritism brings this to us. That is why it's so nice and wonderful to study it, to understand it, to reflect upon it, because it brings us this peace of understanding that we have all the time we need to do everything we need to do. There's no need to fulfill all of our desires and pleasures in this life. I don't need to go to every party. I don't need to go to every beach. I don't need to go everywhere in the world. Focus on what we're here to do. Your mission, which is to learn, to become better, to love your enemies, to love everyone, because that is what the end goal is. The whole world has to be encompassed by this love. The whole family of this world has to love one another. And the good person, and the person who's transcended all of these steps, he or she is commanded by the soul, because they no longer have the need to satisfy these immediate desires, because they recognize that this isn't the only life. So they're not in a hurry to do everything, because we seek oftentimes so many things in search of this inner satisfaction. We seek out so many different things. We want to buy things, acquire things, go to places. And even though we might have done everything possible, we still feel empty. We are wanting all these things, and the more desire, the more things that we fulfill, the more desires we have, and the more frustrated we get because we can't obtain that fulfillment. We can't fill that void. Why? Because you're trying to fill a transcendental void with something that is ephemeral, something that is temporary. Once we transcend this and learn that we need love in our lives, then we need to understand the teachings of Christ. We need to read about Spiritism, learn the doctrine, learn the true essence of the Spirit. We no longer have these needs. And now the soul commands the body. It is no longer the body that commands the soul. So their souls command their physical bodies, allowing them a clearer perception of the future. They are guided by the conscience, because the conscience is the law of God. The law of God is written within the conscience. That's what the superior spirits told us in the Spirits book. So if the law of God is in the conscience, and if we follow the conscience, we are going to be in that right path. We're not going to deviate or get off on a wrong exit before we reach that destination. And true Spiritists, the ones who have understood the doctrine, understood the teachings that Kardec brought to us and the great spirits brought to us, they can be recognized by their moral transformation and by the efforts they make to overcome their bad traits. It takes very little effort, little significant effort, an effort of little significance to overcome our desires and our passions. What lacks is the willpower. Most of us, we do not have the willpower to overcome these desires and these passions. And it is through learning these wonderful teachings, and it is through learning that we are here to progress and advance, and that we have many lives yet, and learning that we have a wonderful future ahead of us with many different opportunities, that we begin to control these passions. Because we know that it's not going to lead us to any good. The consequences are not going to be any good. What good is it to fulfill a passion that is an immediate need? Where is it going to take us? Nowhere. Temporarily, we might be satisfied, but then what? What else? What other sip of that big glass of material satisfaction do you need? Eventually, that glass is going to run out. So the glass of the living water of the Christ and the living water of the truth never runs out. And it truly quenches our spiritual thirst, which is a thirst that needs to be quenched for all of us. And in the book Impermanence and Immortality, or Impermanência e Imortalidade, by the spirit Carlos Torres Pastorino. He dictated this, and it was psychographed or written by the medium Divaldo Pereira Franco. There is a quote in the chapter entitled Selfishness that says, "The continuous action of the conscience in ascension will reach the cosmic stage when it is no longer the individual, the persona that is presented, but the spirit that is in control." And this summarizes what I've just mentioned here. And Jesus brought us the parable of the sower. And the parable of the sower more or less summarizes all of these things, these different stages of individuals that are found here on earth, in this existence, in this relative stage that we are in. And in the parable of Matthew 13, 1 through 9, and Matthew 13, 18 through 23, the story goes as follows. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the lake. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat in it, while all the people stood on the shore. Then he told them many things in parables, saying, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came up and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still, other seed fell in good soil, where it produced a crop, 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. He who has ears, let him hear. And then Jesus explains the parable. Listen then to what the parable of the sower means. When anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in his heart. This is the seed sown along the path. The one who received the seed that fell on rocky places is the man who hears the word and at once receives it with joy. But since he has no root, he lasts only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, he quickly falls away. The one who received the seed that fell among the thorns is the man who hears the word, but the worries of his life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke it, making it unfruitful. But the one who received the seed that fell on good soil is the man who hears the word and understands it. He produces a crop yielding 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. So let's dissect this a bit using a modern allegory or an analogy. Listen then to what the parable of the sower means. When anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in his heart. We can think of this as the person who is driving along that highway and there are all types of things around him. Billboards, the radio is on, but he can't listen. He doesn't have the ears to hear because he's so worried and focused about his current life and the worries and the things that are going on that he doesn't even know what is around him. He is completely and entirely consumed by the earthly life. He doesn't even know that there is something else. That is the first part, the first individual, the first level. This is the seed sown along the path. The one who received the seed that fell on rocky places is the man who hears the word and at once receives it with joy. But since he has no root, he lasts only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, he quickly falls away. This is the man in that car in that same highway who has the radio on, kind of hears the word, is able to see what's on the billboard, the messages on the billboard, and is happy to see these things, happy to hear the message, but pretty soon he's distracted because a text message came through or the phone rang, and now he forgot about these messages. He forgot about the truth. He once again came back and is now worried about this life and this world. And then we have the one who received the seed that fell among the thorns is the man who hears the word, but the worries of his life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke it, making it unfruitful. Here is the man again in that same highway with the radio on. He sees the billboards, reads the messages, likes what he hears, but something distracts him. The lush vegetation, the trees, the tall trees of green, of greed, of ambition, begin to block the billboards, and he can no longer read the messages, and he becomes distracted, and is instead of focusing on those messages on the billboard, he is now focused on the green. It's a metaphor for money, in case you didn't understand. And he's focused on that, on acquisitions, on power, on what he can obtain here on this earth, forgetting about the essence and the teaching that Christ is bringing to us in this parable. That's why I think this parable is amazing. It is the parable. And then we have the one who received the seed that fell on good soil, is the man who hears the word and understands it. He produces a crop yielding 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. This is the man who is in that car, has the radio on. He sees the billboards, reads the billboards, loves the messages, reflects on the messages, absorbs the messages, lives the messages, hears the messages coming in the radio, and does not lose himself in the highway because he pays attention to the map that's bestowed upon us by divinity. He listens to what the GPS is telling him. What the GPS says. Go straight and keep going until the end because you will get there. Persevere. Don't focus on the potholes. Don't try to swerve the potholes. Go over the potholes because those potholes are going to help you to progress. They're going to teach you to then prevent them from happening in a future occasion so you won't have to swerve then. And this is what this parable teaches us. It teaches us the different relative levels of each spirit that is here on this planet. So we have from the bottom of the tier of this spectrum of trials and expiations to the very top, those who produce and yield a crop, to those who don't even know how to plant a seed. It's a wonderful, wonderful parable. And again, I invite you to read about it on the Gospel according to Spiritism. And to finalize today's talk, I found this message in a book entitled Roteiro. There's no English translation. It is a book written by Chico Xavier, who is the greatest medium to ever incarnate in modern times. And it was psychographed by him, and it was dictated by the Spirit Emmanuel. And this message encompasses everything I've said here. But before getting to this message, Aristotle taught us a very simple lesson, an analogy that I think kind of succinctly summarizes what we need to learn, what we need to do here on earth. And he says, and I'm not quoting verbatim, I'm paraphrasing, he says, a man doesn't become healthy by only knowing what it is he needs to consume to be healthy. A man does not become healthy by knowing that he needs to train in physical activities. A man becomes healthy by engaging in those activities, not only learning them, but reflecting upon them, utilizing them for his own benefit. It's a simple yet deep thought, because if we take this and parallel it with the gospel, we can read the gospel, we can like the messages, but that's not necessarily going to make us a good person. We have to exercise the gospel. We have to live the gospel. Reflect upon the messages. And then, and only then, we might become as perfect here on earth, relatively, as our Heavenly Father is perfect. And then, to close up, the message reads, men after men, intelligences after intelligences, we may be subject to the danger of compromising the progress of the world. Yes, we are stubborn. Isolated in our points of view and in our meager conceptions, but governed by the infinite wisdom, we often try to cage God within the conventions of human understanding. We want to limit him to the vision of a Santa Claus-like figure sitting on a throne. That is not God in the Spiritist perspective. In the Spiritist perspective, and that is why many people don't believe in God, because they can't fathom an old man sitting on a throne governing everything. In the Spiritist perspective, we see God as this cosmic intelligence, this cosmic entity who governs all of the laws that make everything function in this world, in this universe, or in the multiverses, if you will. He is what makes everything run. He is within us, and we are within him. His essence is within us, and we are part of him. We are divine beings. Within us, we have the divine seed, the divine spark. It is up to us to water that seed with the service of sincerity and charity, that charity with the triple aspect of benevolence, indulgence, and forgiveness. By cultivating that inner field within us in the good deeds and acts of love, so that perhaps in the future, the seed that Jesus planted here on earth may blossom into this wonderful tree that will produce fruits that will nourish our other brothers and sisters who need so much still to be able to understand and see the truth. And we are guided towards spiritual perfection in order to one day be definitively divested of the educative scales of the flesh. That is a big, strong statement. Because once we transcend all of these things and we no longer, nothing in the world satisfies us anymore, We don't we don't have desires. We don't have passions. We've transcended. We no longer need to return to a physical existence. We are free as spirits to continue in our ascension and our journey of advancement and progress, because we no longer need, we do not need to be in a human body or in any other body in any other planet incarnated, because we've gone beyond what the worlds can provide for us, and now we need something else. We need to provide for them. That is the beauty of creation, because in the beginning we are guided, and in the end we are given the responsibility to guide as well. When we may be able to comprehend the exalted word of the celestial exhortation, you are gods, John 10:34. We are all gods. We may not feel like we are, we may not think we are, we may not perceive that we are, but we are gods. Why are we gods? Because Jesus told us that we can do everything he does and even more. Because once we understand the truth, once we follow the laws, once we absorb the teachings and behave in accordance with the divine statutes that govern this cosmos and our lives, we embrace the fact that we have a God within each one of us. Not a God, but the God. We are all linked together by this essence, because we are all one family, not only here on Earth, but every other planet that may have a living being or a population. All of them are our neighbors in this giant neighborhood known as the universe. So let us always think about that. Let us reflect about that. And again, to finalize, I encourage you all to read the Spiritist works, because they really truly bring you so much. And they may help you, as they help me, to guide you in the right direction. And understand that life isn't about here, it's about there. Thank you very much, and may God bless each and every one of us always, and may Jesus always guide us in our paths. Thank you.